Hello. Today, we are going to take a look at the different types of sources that you might run into while you are researching. And you will have some other soft chalks and, other bits of information to go over within Blackboard, but this is my sort of review of the different types of sources that you might run into. I'm going to share a screen with you so that you can see it and you have access to this document as well. Now, what's going to happen here is that what I'm using is going to immediately turn off the recording, but I'll be back. So if I say share, okay, so you should be looking at a screen here that has different types of sources here in blue, and then some explanations of those different types of sources. So let's take a quick look at that together. One source type that you will run into will be the scholarly source. And these scholarly sources will be journals and books. With these academic journals, you're going to have very few concerns. They tend to have a truth-seeking purpose and knowledge advancement. Typically, they are created by scholars and researchers, and they have a lot to lose if they publish information that is inaccurate or unreliable. And so we can feel very comfortable. In addition to that, they also will fact check for themselves. So sometimes you will run into what's called the peer-reviewed academic journal. And that simply means that one scholar submits and says, hey, will you please publish this within your journal? And they will not say, oh, sure, we'll do that for you. Instead, they will give copies of that to various other scholars within that field and have it checked. That's that peer review, not unlike what you would do if you handed over your paper to a classmate, right? That's that peer review. So these papers will then be peer reviewed by other scholars within the field. They also will check up on the backgrounds of those who are submitting. So you will have, for instance, they'll be vetting them. They'll say, oh, well, where do you work? What is your rank and affiliation? What is your title? What is your education? Can you really speak to this particular topic? And so, again, that all ends up for us with very few concerns about them. Some defining characteristics are that they are not sold on magazine racks. They do not have advertising. If you were to actually pick up a copy, or even if you're online looking at them, you will see that. They have an academic style with documentation. They're saying, hey, I got this information from here, so they can be a little stuffy to read. However, we'll talk more about that later. They are, again, published by academic publishers and university presses. So when we go into databases, you will see these academic journals. And that's what we're talking about here. Anything that has this academic publisher. This also includes reference works, and those would be things like dictionaries, encyclopedias, atlases. So public affairs sources, these are going to be a little bit different from these other scholarly sources, in that they are newspapers and news magazines, blogs, documentary films. One thing that you can notice is that with newspapers and news magazines, they are going to go to publication much more quickly than, say, a scholarly journal and book. So a scholarly journal is going to be likely to have it peer reviewed. They're going to check it. That means that they won't be publishing every week or every month. Newspapers and news magazines, as you know, are published daily, maybe news magazines publish monthly. So there are some concerns with them. They are typically staff writers, and they have editors who determine the content. That can be tricky to ascertain because it's not necessarily that what they say is incorrect, but it could still be biased because someone is determining what content to omit and what content to leave in. And that can create a bias. While the goal is objectivity, and they don't outright lie, they can vary stories and or they determine what content to exclude or include. They tend to be available on newsstands and by subscription, including on the web. They're owned by news companies, which could have, and often does, have a bias, whoever the owner is, whoever the readers are. They may very well want to, in some ways, pander to a certain clientele. Blogs, of course, have many concerns. There is seldom any oversight of the content beyond the blogger. And so those are going to be published on blog sites. Documentary films, they could also have concerns. They could have a very strong advocacy other than being strictly informative. Their content, what they determine that they're going to say or not say, is dependent on the filmmaker or screenwriter, and they could be biased. So they will be identified as a documentary or nonfiction. They typically contain interviews, which can offer some really nice quotable information because sometimes, not always, but sometimes they interview people who do have very strong credentials. The information could be from esteemed sources, but it could also be biased by the context. The advocacy sources are going to include websites, blogs, advertisements. They can have many concerns. Advocacy means exactly that. They already have a bias, and that position is the one that they are trying to forward. It can often be hard to identify who the writers are. Yeah, you'll find that when you sometimes go to websites. Who wrote this? Well, they may not have an author name. You may end up having to assume that the website itself is the author. Again, they may be advocating for a position. They can be defined by oftentimes .org and .com in the URL, which indicates organization or commercial. Sometimes the advocacy is not announced clearly on the home page, and you have to look for the About Us section of the website. Take a look at that and see what they say about themselves, and use your intuition to understand that what they're saying to you is that they have an advocacy or that they don't. Facts or data can be filtered and out of context to promote the advocacy. What that means for you as a researcher and writer is that you will need to be aware of that. That means that if you start to sense this, you will need to pay close attention. You may have to dive down into the rabbit hole to try to determine if this information is accurate or not. In some ways, it seems like, oh, this would be an easier type of research. But if I could come back up here to scholarly sources, that's already been done for you. And so you don't have to do as much of that rabbit hole dive to determine if this information is accurate, if this information is complete. There are also government sources here. Those are government agencies, perhaps legal documents, political speeches, those types of things. The author concerns that you'll run into for that vary with the type of source. They can be very informative and factual. For instance, if you were looking for the latest tax code, irs.gov would be a great place to go. That will probably be the most up-to-date information that you could find about tax code. However, they also can be biased in their positions and they might filter content. So any sort of factual information might be great. However, if, for instance, the IRS has come under fire for something, they may decide that they're not going to give information about that. For instance, I can give you a specific example. I once had a student who was wanting to write and argue about the government needing to do more about PTSD of returning veterans. And she was feeling very frustrated because she was looking at a lot of the .mil military sites. And from those sites, she was getting the impression that the government was doing everything that it possibly could and that there were no real problems. And when she got away from the .mil sites, she found out that no, there were. But as a .mil site, it opted to give some specific information that might have been factual, but it also had a biased position and filtered content. So they, as I said, they can contain very factual information, but they might be filtered by the sponsor's bias. So in short, you have different types of sources that you're going to run into. The upper crust is going to be the scholarly source, the academic journal, or the university press book. They have already done vetting for you, and they can be recognized by having a very academic style and this truth-seeking goal. Public affairs sources, yes, I'm sure some of you will use newspapers, and these can be actually quite good for really current information. These take a while to be published, so they may not have some of the most up-to-date information if something is a hot topic and going on right at that moment. But they also come with some issues in potentially a bias where they bury stories or positions that don't agree with their prevailing goals of that particular organization. Then you also have advocacy sources come right out and say that they are advocates, and this can take you down the rabbit hole of trying to figure out if you have the correct information and if the information that you have is sufficient or valid. And then, of course, government agencies, which can give really great factual information, but can also have a political bias. So give that some thought every time you think about the sources that you are selecting, because your research is only as good as the sources that you determine to use. It builds your ethos, your ethics, your credibility as a writer to use sources that can't be called out by opposition as faulty in any way. And you will eventually have a flow chart to look at that can help you through this. It's right here in this module, and it's called the Evaluating Sources Flowchart. All right, that's it for now. Bye.